Hello and welcome to Larry Has Opinions. I'm aware it's been a while since the last time I posted, but I wanted to keep up the mid-year freak out tradition. So I just thought I would give you an update on how my reading has gone for the first 6 months of the year. So let's get started. Best book you've read so far in 2023. I've had actually a few 5 stars, possibly more than usual, but I've decided to pick The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I know it's a very famous, very celebrated book that a lot of people have read already, but for me it's the first time I've read it this year, and I wasn't quite sure what to expect because sometimes when books are so hyped, my expectations get a bit high and then I get disappointed, but I'm pleased to say that in this case I found it such a great story. I think just to keep your reader engaged for such a bulky book and a relatively boring environment like this dark academia thing is not the most exciting in itself, and I know that started a certain trend, but I have to say Donna Tartt's writing really keeps you engaged throughout the story. Her characters, they feel like real people that you get to know and you get somehow attached, and they're so believable. So I have to say I was really impressed, and now I think I want to read more by her. Best sequel you've read so far in 2023, and for me it has to be The Trouble with Peace by Joe Abercrombie. This is grimdark fantasy. If you're not familiar with this author or this universe, if you're not a fantasy fan, there's a first trilogy that I read a couple of years ago. There's 4 standalone books, and there's a second trilogy, and this is the second book in the second trilogy, so I'm very much towards the end. And for me, this is the first 5 stars out of all of these books that I've read by Abercrombie. I've enjoyed all of them to a large extent, enough to keep going, but this one is probably the best so far for me, for my personal taste, I have to say, because probably part of the reason why I liked it so much is that there was a bit less emphasis on action scenes, on the military aspect of the story, and more emphasis on the political intrigue and the plotting, the scheming, and the characters, which is what I really love about these stories, a sort of Game of Thrones sort of story, if you like, if you're not familiar with this universe. I want to say that perhaps in the second trilogy, to me, the characters might not be as iconic as those in the first trilogy, but his overall craft seems a lot stronger. The pacing is better, the plot is tighter, they're not dragging like some of his older works. It's a very tight story, very engaging from start to finish. Character work, as usual, is very strong and very enjoyable. So it was another 5 stars for me, and I can't wait to read the last book in the trilogy. New release you haven't read yet but want to. And this is starting to become a not so new release anymore, but I've borrowed Act of Oblivion from the library by Robert Harris. This is historical fiction set during the Civil War. There was quite a buzz about it last year when it first came out. Now it's gone a bit quiet. I'm not even sure how I'm getting away with keeping it for 8 months. I think I've had it from the library and I still haven't read it. I feel like I need to be in the right mood for this kind of story. So I still want to give it a go, but it's definitely been sitting there on the table waiting to get picked up. Most anticipated release for the second half of the year. And if you've watched me for a while, you might remember that I'm a bit of a Ken Follett stan. I really enjoy The Pillars of the Earth. It's possibly one of my favorite books ever. And a new book called The Armor of Light, set in the same Kingsbridge series universe, is about to come out this autumn. I have to say, even though the latest books by Ken Follett I was not as sold on, as some started to feel a bit more formulaic, and I think he's lost a bit of his edge, I don't know. But even so, I'm pretty sure I'm gonna read this, and I'm kind of a little bit excited about giving it a go once it comes out. Biggest disappointment, and it has to be the winner of the International Booker Prize, Time Shelter. This I read even before it won the prize because the premise sounded so intriguing. This is a story that sort of revolves around this clinic that is set up for people who want to take shelter, find refuge in the past in a particular decade. So this clinic has got different floors, dedicated to like the 60s, the 70s, and so on, so that people, especially people that might have mental issues, dementia, and so on, they can sort of plunge back into that decade. And then the story sort of expands to capture a wider narrative around different countries deciding to turn back the clock with some, resonance towards some of the politics of recent years, if you like. So the whole premise was really, really enticing to me. But I have to say, it fell a bit flat. I can see how a lot of people would love this, and I can see how it can win a prize, like a prestigious prize like the International Booker, because it's a very original story with solid writing and everything. But for me, it wasn't entirely convincing. I found that it was rambling a little bit too much for my liking. It was a bit self-indulgent in that sort of, oh, look, I'm so clever, sort of style of writing at points. The narrative was a little bit disjointed, so I didn't hate it or anything, but it was a bit of a disappointment because I was expecting it to be another 5 stars or, really solid 4, and for me, it didn't quite hit the mark. Bigger surprise, and this is at the other end of the spectrum, if you like. This was the first book that I read in 2023, and it's Trust by Herman Diaz, which has actually won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction since. This, I wasn't too sure about whether I wanted to read it or not, because the subject is essentially the exploration of this story of how a company was set up in the 20s, and it's a story within the story. And it really touches on the usual themes about entrenched privilege and capitalism, and how success in that world can be set up, and how it continues through the generations. And sometimes I find this sort of stories a bit underwhelming, a bit boring, a bit heavy on the cliches. But in this case, I was really blown away. As I said, it's a story within a story, so there's an element of mystery because part of the novel is a novel within the novel, if you like, and then slowly you're trying to untangle this whole mystery around how this whole enterprise came about, and who did what, and what the role was of the different people, whether the women or the woman, if you like, in the story had the role that the traditional narrative would have got, or perhaps she had a bigger role. By the time women in business was not really a thing, and so on. There's so much to it, and some of my memories now are a bit vague 6-7 months later, but it really left a strong impression. I was really, really pleased when I saw it won the Pulitzer Prize, and it really surprised me because I thought I heard about it so much that it made me curious about it, but I was really prepared to be disappointed, and I was really pleasantly surprised. Favorite new author, debut or new to you? I didn't want to repeat myself. Definitely some of the authors I've just talked about left a strong impression, but to name a different one, I've chosen Julian Barnes. So very much not a debut author, but just new to me. For the first time this year, I've decided to read The Sense of an Ending, and I was really impressed. I believe it won the Booker Prize a few years ago, and I also just watched the movie straight after finishing the book. I'm really impressed whenever an author can tell a story in such a short book. I feel like so many authors can't really control themselves and just indulge in expanding their narrative and just keep going and keep rambling. So whenever an author manages to really pack a punch in a short story of a 150, 200 page book, I'm always very impressed. In this case, The Sense of an Ending sort of reminded me a little bit of like The Remains of the Day by Ishiguro, in terms of how it's not trying to tell a very grand story. It's very much grounded in kind of our day-to-day experiences and the passing of time, and the themes around regrets and the choices that you make in your life and how they might still kind of haunt you throughout the years, that sort of thing. So I was really impressed by the book. It wasn't quite 5 stars for me, but it wasn't too short of that bar, if you like. So I really want to read more by him. The next 2 prompts are newest fictional crush and newest favorite character. I'm going to bunch them together. And when it comes to characters, for me, it often comes back to Joe Abercrombie if I've read anything by him, because these characters are so memorable. I don't really get crushes on book characters typically, but if I really have to pick one out of all the books that I read the first half of the year, then I might say someone like Leo from the First Law universe, just because, you know, he's supposed to be so handsome, a little bit stupid. I mean, what's that not to like? And favorite character, perhaps also, again, like really self-aware, really sarcastic, and really memorable character, and really enjoyable to read and to follow in his adventures and in his internal monologue and internal processing of the events around him. So as usual, Joe Abercrombie hit the marks when it comes to character work. Book that made you cry. And the same way I don't really get fictional crushes, it's very, very unusual for me to cry reading a book as well. I'm a bit of a emotionless bastard that way, I guess. But if I really have to pick one, I might pick Say Nothing, which is non-fiction, and it's all set in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. But it's not trying to be like an overall telling reenactment of the whole history of the Troubles. It's just picking some specific aspects of things that happened during that time and trying to sort of tell that story. And it's one that I could very much recommend very widely, both to people who are interested in the history of Northern Ireland, which I've always been myself, but even if you're not, because it really almost reads like a thriller, I think it can still be read and appreciated by someone who doesn't know very much or hasn't really thought about that section of our history, if you like. It was such a strong book, and as I said, even though it didn't really make me cry, the fact that some of these events, for instance, around people being made to disappear by the IRA, some of these events are quite hard hitting. So, you know, it's definitely a book that can make you a bit emotional from that point of view as well. It was a very strong read. This was another of my 5-star reads for the year, so it's a very strong recommendation from me. Book that made you happy. I'm really struggling with this one because I went through the whole list of books that I read in the first half of the year and I could not find a single happy book. So just to say something, I'm just going to say Foster by Claire Keegan. Claire Keegan is an Irish author who very recently wrote Small Things Like These that I read last year, 2 years ago. And I was really impressed in the way she was able to tell such a strong story in a short book, making that point again. So when I picked up Foster, which is not remotely a happy story, just to reiterate, it's about this young girl who's given into foster care and she comes from a difficult family. Again, the story is all set in Ireland. I wasn't sure if this book would also sort of live up to my expectations that I had for this author from that other book that I read. And I was really happy when it did. It wasn't quite as strong as Small Things Like These for me, but it was definitely very, very solid book with her very distinctive prose that she has as well. So that sort of made me happy. Favorite book to film adaptation that you saw this year? It's probably Station 11. Station 11 is, again, one of my all-time favorite books, possibly by Emily St. John's Mandel. I would imagine most people are familiar with the story, but it's about a pandemic, but was written way before the COVID pandemic. And if you like a proper pandemic where 99% of the world population dies. And it's kind of set split between different timelines, some before, some during, some after, and especially in the after, there's this company that gets gathered to perform Shakespeare because survival is not sufficient, because human nature is also to kind of look for deeper meaning, for art, for creativity, and so on. So that was one of my all-time favorite books ever. So I watched the adaptation this year, and I was quite impressed. I wouldn't say it's one of my all-time favorite TV shows I've ever watched, but I thought it really managed to capture the spirit, even despite all the changes they might have made. The spirit of the book is very much reflected in that somewhat pretentious so atmosphere that you get in the story, but also it's kind of such a rich and subtle story that I think was really well done and really enjoyable. Most beautiful book you've bought so far this year or received? I have not bought a single physical book, and I've not received one either, so I've absolutely nothing to show. If you watch me or follow me for a while, you know I mostly do ebooks or just get books from the library. I don't really buy physical books, so there you go. What books do you need to read before the end of the year? I'd say the only one that I need to read is Love Later by Mark Hyatt, and I need to read it because it's for a book club that I'm part of, so I sort of need to finish it before we get together to talk about it. And it's the story of this young gay man in 1960 something in London, and he's a bit aimless. He doesn't quite know what to do with himself. He's just hooking up with random guys and just kind of going from job to begging friends to get money, that sort of thing. And I've just started it and I need to finish it. Not quite sure what to make of it yet, but we'll see. Thank you so much for watching. If you're an existing subscriber, thanks a lot for still being here, even though it might be 2 videos a year. I really appreciate you sticking around. If you're new to the channel, thank you so much. Hit that subscribe button and maybe in 6 months you'll have another video to watch. So thank you so much, and I'll see you the next time.